Gideon Vale crossed the last miles to Spokane with an old German shepherd beside him and a homecoming he had rehearsed in silence for years. But through his own window he saw the woman he had waited for, sitting beside another man. He did not shout. He did not knock. He simply placed the key back and walked away. That same night, a Montana snowstorm shattered his Jeep and left him bleeding beside his aging German shepherd. Then one small porch light appeared through the trees, leading him to two elderly strangers with troubles of their own. What began as heartbreak became a fight for a forgotten town, a stolen home, and a family no one expected to find. Tell us where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep creating heartfelt stories like this. Snow fell softly over Spokane, gentle enough to look merciful from a distance. Gideon Vale sat behind the wheel of his old Jeep for a long moment before turning off the engine. The house at the end of the quiet street glowed with warm yellow light, the kind of light a man carried in his mind through bad weather, bad missions, and the long dead hours before dawn, when memory became more dangerous than gunfire. For years, that light had meant home. He had imagined this return more times than he cared to admit, not loudly. Gideon was not a man who built castles out of hope. But in the narrow spaces between deployments, in the silence after the shooting stopped, in the cold metal belly of aircraft flying him from one desert to another, he had allowed himself one small picture. A kitchen lamp, coffee on the counter, his wife turning when the door opened, a breathless laugh, a hand over her mouth, maybe tears, maybe anger first, because love sometimes came dressed as anger when it had waited too long. Bishop shifted in the passenger seat beside him. The old German shepherd had his muzzle resting on his paws, but his amber eyes were open. His coat, black along the saddle and deep honey gold at the chest and legs, had gone silver around the mouth. One torn edge marked his left ear, a small souvenir from a life neither of them had ever fully left behind. He watched Gideon now with the quiet patience of a creature who had learned not to interrupt grief before it had shown its face. Gideon reached over and placed 2 fingers between Bishop's ears. "Almost there, boy," he said. His voice sounded strange in the Jeep, rusted, unused. He stepped out into the falling snow with a green duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The cold touched his face, finding the thin scar near the bridge of his nose and the old ache beneath his left collarbone. He wore his olive-drab combat shirt beneath a faded field jacket, camouflage sleeves tight at his forearms, the horizontal bands at his biceps, half hidden by melting snow. The shirt was old, comfortable, practical. Like many things Gideon kept, it had survived because it did not ask questions. Bishop jumped down more slowly than he once had, his paws landing with care on the thin white layer covering the driveway. The house looked the same from the outside, white trim, blue-gray siding. The porch swing Gideon had fixed the summer before his second-to-last deployment. The clay pot beside the front step where his wife had once hidden the spare key and laughed when he called it terrible security. "You forget everything except how to disappear," she had said then. He had kissed her in that doorway, with sawdust still on his hands. Now the curtains were not fully closed. A narrow gap remained in the front window, and through that gap, Gideon saw the living room. At first, his mind refused to understand the shape of what it saw. Combat had taught him to process threats quickly, but pain had different rules. Pain arrived dressed as ordinary objects. 2 wine glasses on the coffee table, a man's hand resting along the back of the couch. His wife, leaning close, smiling at something, said too softly for Gideon to hear. The man wore a red flannel shirt. Gideon knew that shirt. He had bought it years ago at a roadside store in Idaho because his wife said it made him look less like a soldier and more like somebody who might remember to buy eggs. He had left it hanging in the hall closet before his last stretch away. Now it lay across another man's shoulders. For a moment, Gideon did not move. Snow gathered on his hair, on the worn shoulders of his jacket, on the duffel bag strap digging into his palm. His wife laughed, not cruelly. That was what made it worse. She laughed softly, freely, with a kind of ease Gideon had not heard from her in years. The sound did not belong to betrayal alone. It belonged to a life that had continued without him, rearranging furniture inside itself until there was no place left for the man standing in the snow. Then he saw the photograph. Their wedding picture had always sat on the small shelf beside the bookcase. He remembered the frame because he had cracked one corner of it during a move, and she had refused to replace it. "Proof we survived bad packing," she had said. The frame was still there, but it was turned face down. Something inside Gideon did not break dramatically. It did not shatter like glass in a movie or burst open like a wound. It simply went quiet. A battlefield after the smoke cleared. Bishop came to stand beside him. The dog did not bark, did not growl, did not strain toward the door. He only pressed his shoulder against Gideon's leg, solid and warm, the weight of him saying what words could not. Gideon looked down. Bishop's old eyes held him there. In those eyes were deserts, gunmetal dawns, helicopter wind, blood on sand, frost on tents, and the stubborn fact that one living soul had never stopped coming back to him. Gideon's hand moved slowly to his left ring finger. He did not remove the ring, not yet. Instead, he walked to the porch. Each step felt measured, almost ceremonial, as if he were entering a church where the god had already left. He did not knock. He did not try the door. He did not call her name. He crouched beside the clay pot. The spare key was still underneath. For some reason, that nearly undid him. Not the man inside, not the flannel, not even the turned photograph. It was the key, waiting faithfully in the same hiding place, still believing someone might need a way in. Gideon picked it up, held it in his gloved hand, and remembered her voice. "In case you forget your way home." He stared at the key until snow melted along his knuckles. Then he placed it back beneath the pot. Not thrown, not dropped, placed. A small burial. Bishop gave a low, uneasy whine. Gideon stood, turned away from the door, and walked back to the jeep. He did not look into the window again. He trusted what he had seen. More than that, he trusted what he had felt. The terrible calm of a man who knew the battle was over before anyone fired. Inside the jeep, he sat with both hands on the steering wheel. For a long minute, he did nothing. Bishop climbed into the passenger seat and rested his muzzle near Gideon's elbow. The old dog smelled of snow, leather, and the faint medicinal scent from the ointment Gideon used on his joints during cold weather. Gideon finally exhaled. "All right," he whispered. "We're not staying." He pulled away from the curb without headlights for the first few seconds, as if even the jeep understood that departure should be quiet. Only when he reached the end of the street did he turn them on. The road north opened black and silver beneath the falling snow. He did not call anyone. There was no one to call. His father was gone. His mother had been gone longer. His marriage had just become a room with someone else sitting in it. So Gideon drove toward the one place that existed before all of that. Frosthaven, Montana, a small mountain town near the Beartooth Range, where he had been born, and where his grandfather, Silas Vale, had left behind an old cabin on a hill. Gideon had not seen the place in years. He remembered warped floorboards, a cold iron stove, pine trees, and Silas teaching him how to split wood with more patience than force. "Wood knows when you're angry," Silas used to say. "So do dogs. So do women, if you're unlucky enough to deserve one." At that memory, Gideon almost smiled. Almost. The miles passed beneath the tires. City lights disappeared behind him. The highway narrowed. Snow thickened across the windshield, and the wipers began to complain. Beside him, Bishop slept in uneasy fragments, waking whenever Gideon's grip tightened too hard on the wheel. By the time he crossed into Montana, the storm had changed its mind about being gentle. Wind came hard from the north, shoving snow sideways across the road. The world beyond the windshield shrank to two pale tunnels of headlight and the ghostly flash of roadside pines. Gideon slowed, leaning forward, his eyes moving with trained precision from shoulder to tree line to the dark wall of rock rising to his left. Near midnight, he reached the old county road leading toward Frosthaven. A sign stood crooked near the turnoff, half buried in blown snow. Gideon caught only pieces of it in the headlights. Caution, rockfall, North Star Ridge Survey Area. He frowned. The name meant nothing to him, not yet. Just another company staking flags into land that had once belonged only to weather, animals, and stubborn people. Bishop lifted his head, his ears sharpened forward. "What is it?" Gideon asked. The dog did not bark. He stared toward the dark slope beyond the windshield, his body suddenly still. Then the mountain answered. A cracking sound split through the storm. Not thunder, not a tree. Stone. Gideon reacted before thought arrived. One hand snapped the wheel, right as something huge dropped from the white darkness above. The impact slammed into the front of the Jeep with a sound like a giant fist striking metal. The hood buckled. Glass burst inward. The world spun sideways. For a few seconds there was only noise. Snow, steel, Bishop's sharp yelp, Gideon's shoulder hitting hard. The Jeep sliding, tilting, then crashing down off the road into a shallow ditch packed with snow. Then silence. Not true silence. The storm still howled. The engine ticked and hissed. Somewhere under the hood, fluid dripped onto hot metal. But inside Gideon's skull, everything went white. He opened his eyes. Blood ran warm down the side of his face. His left shoulder burned. His ribs protested when he breathed. For half a second he was not in Montana. He was back in another wreck, another night, another place where smoke and snow could have been dust and ash. Then Bishop whimpered. Gideon turned so fast, pain flashed across his vision. "Bishop!" The dog lay against the passenger door, struggling to rise. A deep cut marked his front right leg, dark against gold fur. Not fatal. Bad enough. Gideon forced his seatbelt loose and reached for him. "I've got you," he said, though his own voice shook now. "Easy, boy. Easy." The Jeep would not start. The phone showed one trembling bar, then none. The heater coughed out its last weak breath and died. Gideon looked through the cracked windshield. The road was above them somewhere. The ditch was filling fast. Snow hammered the glass and swept over the hood. The temperature would drop harder before dawn. If they stayed, Bishop would not make it. That thought cleared him like cold water. Gideon found the emergency kit under the seat, tore open gauze with his teeth, and wrapped Bishop's injured leg as best he could. Then he ripped a strip from the hem of his own shirt and tied it firm. Bishop watched him the whole time, panting softly, trusting him with the terrible patience of the wounded. "You and me," Gideon whispered. Same as always. Getting out of the Jeep took nearly everything. The driver's door groaned against packed snow before giving way. Wind hit Gideon like a thrown wall. He dragged the duffel free, then helped Bishop down into the ditch. The dog tried to stand. His injured leg buckled. Gideon caught him before he fell. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." He looped the duffel across his chest, slid one arm beneath Bishop's body, and lifted as much of the old dog's weight as he could. Bishop was heavy, warm, alive. Gideon staggered up from the ditch, boots punching deep into snow. For several minutes, there was no direction, only storm. Then Bishop raised his head. The dog stared past Gideon's shoulder into the trees. His torn ear twitched. His breathing changed. Gideon turned. Far off through the blowing white, nearly swallowed by pine trunks and night, a small yellow light glowed. A porch light. It was weak. Almost nothing. But almost nothing had kept men alive before. Gideon adjusted his hold on Bishop and began walking. The wind erased his tracks behind him. Snow clung to his eyelashes, melted against the blood on his temple, froze again along his jaw. His shoulders screamed. His legs trembled. More than once, he had to stop and lower Bishop carefully so both of them could breathe. Each time, the dog tried to stand beside him. Each time, Gideon lifted him again. He was not marching toward victory. He was not charging into battle. He was only a man who had lost one home and was too stubborn to lose the last loyal heart that still beat beside him. The light flickered through the trees. Closer now. Gideon fixed his eyes on it the way sailors once fixed their faith on stars. Behind him lay the house where his old life had ended. Beneath him, the snow tried to pull him down. Ahead, one small light burned in the dark, asking for nothing, promising nothing, yet refusing to go out. Gideon held Bishop tighter and walked toward it. The porch light was smaller up close. From the road, it had looked like a promise. Standing beneath it, with snow packed around his boots and Bishop's weight sagging against his side, Gideon Vale saw that it was only an old yellow bulb trembling inside a rusted metal fixture. Still, it was burning. The cabin stood back from the narrow road, half sheltered by pines bowed under snow. Its roof was steep and dark, its logs weathered gray by decades of Montana winters. Wind pushed through the trees and made the metal wind chimes on the porch clatter with a thin, nervous music. They were made from bent nails, old washers, and pieces of something that might once have belonged to farm equipment. Nothing about the place looked rich. Everything about it looked stubborn. Gideon reached the first step and nearly missed it. His knees gave a small, treacherous dip beneath him. Bishop leaned hard into his leg, not because the dog had strength to offer, but because he was trying anyway. "Almost," Gideon breathed. He lifted his hand and knocked. At least, he meant to knock. What came out was a dull scrape of knuckles against wood. He tried again. This time the sound carried. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Gideon stood with one hand braced against the doorframe, blood drying stiffly along his temple, snow melting down the back of his neck. He could hear a stove inside, wood popping. A floorboard shifting, then a bolt slid back. The door opened only a foot. An old man stood in the gap with a heavy flashlight in one hand and a shotgun held low in the other. He did not raise it. He did not need to. His gray eyes did the measuring first. He was tall, even with age, bending him slightly, built from the old mountain pattern, broad shoulders, thick wrists, a face carved by weather and the habit of not complaining when pain entered the room. A white beard covered his jaw, trimmed short but not gently. His flannel shirt hung open over a thermal undershirt, and his boots were already on, as if sleep had never fully convinced him to undress. Gideon lifted his free hand slowly. "Name's Gideon Vale," he said, but the words came out rough and broken. "Jeep went off the road. Rockfall. My dog's hurt." The old man's eyes flicked from Gideon's face to the duffel strap across his chest, then down to Bishop. Bishop stood with his front right leg held slightly off the porch boards. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage. Snow dusted his black and gold coat, and his silver muzzle trembled from cold. Even injured, he did not lower his head in fear. He simply stood beside Gideon, old soldier beside old soldier, asking for nothing more than the chance to remain upright. A woman appeared behind the old man. She was small, wrapped in a pale wool sweater that looked too large for her narrow shoulders. Her white hair was pinned loosely at the back of her head, with several strands fallen near her face. She took in Gideon, the blood, the storm, the shotgun, and then her gaze settled on Bishop. Her expression changed, not into fear, into grief, almost. "Oh, Elias," she said softly. "That dog needs fire." The old man did not move at once. "Could be trouble, Nora." Trouble doesn't usually bleed that politely on the porch. For one strange second, even through pain and cold, Gideon almost laughed. Almost. He reached inside his jacket slowly and pulled out his old military ID with two stiff fingers. Elias angled the flashlight toward it. The beam shook slightly, though whether from age or wind, Gideon could not tell. "Navy," Elias muttered. "Was." Most men who say "was" still carry it in their shoulders. Gideon had no answer for that. Elias looked again at Bishop, then at the way Gideon stood slightly in front of him, despite being barely able to keep his balance. The shotgun lowered another inch. "Get in before my wife adopts the dog and leaves you to freeze." Nora opened the door wider. Warmth struck Gideon so suddenly that it hurt. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, coffee gone bitter in the pot, wool blankets, and potato soup. It was not the soft warmth of comfort bought easily. It was the fought-for warmth of split logs, patched windows, and hands that knew exactly how much winter cost. Gideon stepped inside and nearly went down. Elias caught his elbow with surprising strength. "Easy. I've got him," Gideon said automatically, meaning Bishop. "No," Elias replied. "You don't. Not by yourself." That landed somewhere Gideon was too tired to protect. Nora spread a thick blanket near the black iron stove, then knelt despite the stiffness in her knees. She did not rush Bishop. She held out her hand and let him smell her fingers first. "There now," she whispered. "You're allowed to be tired here." Bishop watched her for a moment. Then, with a slow breath, he lowered himself onto the blanket. Gideon stared. Bishop did not trust strangers. Not quickly. Not kindly. He tolerated people when Gideon asked him to, but tolerance and trust were different animals. Yet here he was, letting this small woman touch the snow-matted fur along his neck as if he had known her before the storm. Elias noticed Gideon noticing. "Dogs got better judgment than most men," he said. "Usually better than mine," Gideon answered. Nora glanced up. "Then listen to him tonight." The words were gentle, but they did not feel soft. They felt like a hand placed against a door before it could slam shut. Elias brought a dented metal first aid kit from a shelf near the back hall. The kit was old, but organized with military precision. Gauze, antiseptic, tape, scissors, a thermometer, pain relievers, even a wrapped suture packet gone yellow with age. Gideon dropped to one knee beside Bishop. Nora reached for his arm. "Your head first." "His leg first." "You're bleeding on my floor. I'll clean it." Elias gave a short grunt that might have been approval or irritation. With men like him, the two often wore the same coat. Gideon's fingers shook as he unwrapped the strip of torn fabric from Bishop's leg. The cut was deep enough to need stitches, but not as bad as it had looked in the ditch. Still, the sight of it pulled something tight inside him. Bishop had followed him out of deserts, out of gunfire, out of grief. The dog had crossed the world at Gideon's side, and now Gideon had led him into a mountain storm because he could not bear to stand in front of one lit window a minute longer. "I'm sorry," he whispered, too low for the others. Bishop turned his head and licked Gideon's wrist once. No accusation. That almost hurt more. Nora warmed water. Elias cut away the ruined bandage. Gideon cleaned the wound while Bishop lay still, only his ears twitching when the antiseptic stung. The old dog's discipline filled the small room like another kind of prayer. Once Bishop was wrapped properly, Elias pointed at a wooden chair near the stove. "Sit. I'm fine. Son, I've seen fence posts with more life in them. I said I'm fine. And I heard you. Didn't make it true." Nora stood, hands on her hips now, her softness briefly replaced by command. "Gideon Vale, sit down before you fall on my dog. My dog." Bishop's tail gave one tired thump against the blanket. Gideon sat. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. Nora cleaned the cut on his forehead with warm water. Her touch was careful, not motherly in any simple way. She did not fuss. She worked as if kindness were a skill, practiced over many winters. Up close, she smelled faintly of lavender soap and flour. "You came from the West Road?" Elias asked. Gideon nodded. "County should have closed it. Sign was half buried. Rockfall's been worse since those survey crews started cutting up the ridge." Gideon's eyes lifted. "North Star?" Elias paused just long enough for the name to become heavier. "North Star Ridge," he said. "Company out of somewhere with glass offices and soft hands. Wants to turn half this mountain into a playground for people who think winter is pretty because they can leave it." Nora gave him a look. "Not tonight." Elias shut his mouth. But the silence did not erase the bitterness. Gideon filed the name away without meaning to. Old habit, a loose thread in a dark room. Nora pressed gauze to his temple. "Hold this." He obeyed. She moved to the stove and ladled potato soup into a bowl, then set it in front of him with bread thick enough to build a wall. Gideon stared at it. "I can pay," he said. Elias snorted. "With what?" "Blood? I have cash in the Jeep." "Your Jeep is in a ditch." "Still has cash. Then it can buy soup when it climbs out." Nora's mouth twitched. "Eat." Gideon ate. The soup was plain and hot and almost unbearable. After the cold, after the window, after the crash, the simple fact of being handed food without being asked to explain his damage struck him harder than he expected. He kept his eyes on the bowl. Across the room, Bishop had fallen asleep with his muzzle on his paws. Nora followed Gideon's gaze. "What's his name?" "Bishop. That's a serious name. He earned it. Did he serve with you?" Gideon nodded once. Nora did not ask where. That was another kindness. Elias sat across from Gideon with a cup of black coffee, studying him over the rim. "You headed to Frosthaven?" "Cabin outside town. Belonged to my grandfather." "Name?" "Silas Vale." The cup stopped halfway to Elias's mouth. It was brief. A lesser man might have missed it. Gideon did not. "You knew him?" Gideon asked. Elias took a drink before answering. Everybody knew Silas. "That's not what I asked." "No," Elias said. "It isn't." Nora turned from the stove. Something quiet passed between husband and wife, old as a scar beneath clothing. Elias set the cup down. "Storm's too loud for old stories." It was not a refusal exactly. More like a door closed with care, not locked. Gideon did not push. He had spent enough years around men with buried rooms inside them to recognize the sound of one being guarded. Later, Nora brought blankets. Elias checked the front windows, then the back door, then the stove, moving with the ritual precision of a man who trusted preparation more than luck. Gideon offered to sleep on the floor near Bishop, but Nora pointed to the worn couch by the stove. "You'll sleep there. I don't want to put you out. You already bled on the floor. The couch is nothing." Elias made a sound from near the door. "Woman's got a point." Gideon lowered himself onto the couch, boots still on. Bishop opened one eye from the blanket and huffed softly, displeased that Gideon was not closer. "I'm here," Gideon said. The dog closed his eye again. For a while, the cabin settled into the storm. Wind leaned against the walls. Snow hissed at the windows. Somewhere in the rafters, old wood creaked like a ship remembering the sea. Gideon did not sleep at first. He watched the fire move behind the stove glass and listened to Nora washing dishes quietly in the kitchen. He heard Elias murmur something about bringing in more wood before dawn. He heard Bishop breathing. He did not hear the voice of his wife. He did not see the window. That, for the moment, was mercy enough. Morning arrived without sunlight. The storm had weakened but not left. The world outside the windows was a blur of white and gray, pine branches heavy with snow. Gideon woke to the smell of coffee and the low ache of injuries announcing themselves one by one. Bishop was awake before him, lying on the blanket near the stove. Nora sat beside him on a low stool, gently rubbing behind his good ear while reading the label on a bottle of medicine. "You've got an old soul," she told the dog. Bishop thumped his tail once. Gideon sat up slowly. "Morning," Nora said. "You look less dead." High praise. "I'm known for generosity." Elias came in from the mudroom, snow on his boots and shoulders. "Doctor's coming." Gideon frowned. "You called a doctor?" "You hit your head. Dog needs stitches. Unless seals grow new skin different than the rest of us." "Navy never approved that upgrade," Gideon muttered. Nora smiled into her coffee. The doctor arrived an hour later in an aging blue pickup with chains on the tires. Doctor. Hollis Pike was a compact man in his early 60s with a gray mustache, a canvas medical bag, and the calm expression of someone who had delivered babies, set bones, treated livestock, and argued with stubborn old ranchers before breakfast. He examined Gideon first, despite Gideon's objection. Bump on the head, shallow cut, bruised shoulder, mild sprain, Hollis said. "You'll live, which I can tell disappoints you." "Not disappointed. Could have fooled me." Then he knelt beside Bishop. The dog watched him carefully, but allowed the examination after Gideon rested a hand near his collar. "Good boy," Hollis murmured. "Front leg needs a few stitches. Clean wound, considering. He's older, so keep him off it. No running, no jumping, no heroic nonsense." Bishop looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back. "He's talking to both of us," Elias grunted. "Finally, a doctor I like." By afternoon, the road was not safe enough for travel. Gideon stood near the front window, one arm stiff at his side, watching snow slide from the porch roof in heavy sheets. The cabin bore fresh wounds of its own. One porch support had cracked under the storm weight. The stovepipe leaned wrong. Near the woodshed, part of the roof had caved inward. Elias followed his gaze. "Don't start." "I didn't say anything." "You looked." "Didn't know looking was a crime in Frosthaven. It is when men with busted shoulders start thinking they're useful." Gideon turned from the window. "I can brace the porch. Temporary fix." "No." "Stovepipe needs checking too." "No." "Woodshed won't make another storm." Elias's jaw tightened. "I said no." The word carried more than stubbornness. It carried age, pride, fear, and the humiliation of needing help from a stranger who had arrived half-frozen at midnight. Gideon recognized all of it, so he did not offer pity. He reached for his jacket. Elias narrowed his eyes. "Where are you going?" "To pay for the room." Nora, standing by the stove, looked between them. Elias scowled. "You're not rebuilding my house." "Good. I'm not qualified for that. I'm just stopping it from falling on your soup." For 1 second, no one spoke. Then Nora laughed. It was not loud, but it changed the room. Even Elias's mouth betrayed him, twitching under his white beard before he crushed the expression down. "Stubborn fool," the old man muttered. Gideon opened the door, and cold air swept in, bright and sharp. Behind him, Bishop lifted his head from the blanket, amber eyes following. "Stay," Gideon told him. Bishop huffed once, deeply offended. Nora leaned down and stroked the dog's silver muzzle. "Let him pretend he's in charge, Bishop. Men need hobbies." Outside, Gideon stepped onto the damaged porch with Elias beside him a moment later, carrying a hammer he claimed Gideon was not allowed to use wrong. The storm still moved through the pines, but softer now. The cabin stood wounded, smoking, alive, and for the first time since Gideon had seen the turned-down photograph in Spokane, he found himself facing something broken that did not ask him to walk away. It only needed both hands. Inside, Bishop lay by the fire, with Nora beside him, watching the door like an old guardian who had decided, for now, that these people were worth keeping. Elias Crowder did not say goodbye like a man saying goodbye. He said it like a man giving orders to weather. "Road's clear enough if you don't drive like an idiot," he told Gideon from the porch, holding a thermos out as if it were ammunition. Gideon accepted it with his good hand. His shoulder still ached where the crash had driven pain deep into the joint, and the cut on his forehead had stiffened under a neat strip of gauze. Nora had insisted on replacing twice before breakfast. "I'll try to disappoint you less than expected," Gideon said. Elias grunted. "Don't aim too high." Nora came out behind him, carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread and a jar of preserves. She was small against the white morning, her pale sweater tucked beneath a gray-blue coat, her silver hair hidden under a soft knit hat. She had the look of a woman who had spent her whole life packing warmth into things before sending them into cold places. She tucked the bread into Gideon's duffel before he could object. "That's too much," he said. "It's bread, not a marriage proposal," Elias muttered. "She makes both sound dangerous." Nora ignored him and bent toward Bishop. The German shepherd stood beside the jeep, his front right leg freshly wrapped, his black and gold coat brushed dry from the night before. Age silvered his muzzle, but his amber eyes were steady. When Nora placed both hands gently around his face, Bishop did not pull away. He leaned into her palms, the faintest surrender from a dog who had never surrendered to much of anything. "You mind that leg," she whispered. "And don't let him pretend he's fine when he isn't." Bishop's tail moved once. Gideon watched the exchange and felt something in his chest tighten not painfully this time, but carefully, like a knot being tested. "He listens better than I do," he said. Nora looked up. "Most good dogs do." Elias stepped down from the porch, boots crunching into snow. He glanced toward the patched beam Gideon had helped brace the day before, then toward the road that wound between the pines. "You find that cabin of Silas's," he said. "You check the stove before lighting it. Chimney was never right even when your grandfather was alive." Gideon looked at him. There it was again. A door half opened, then held in place by one old hand. "You knew him well?" Gideon asked. Elias's jaw shifted under his white beard. Knew of him. It was not true. Gideon let the lie stand. Some lies were not built to deceive, some were fences around grief. He climbed into the Jeep, which now ran only because a county tow driver had pulled it from the ditch at dawn and declared it ugly but stubborn enough for Montana. The hood was dented badly, one headlight cracked, and the front grille looked like it had lost an argument with a small bear. Still, the engine turned over. Bishop climbed carefully into the passenger seat with Gideon's help. Nora stood on the porch waving until the cabin disappeared behind the pines. Elias did not wave, but he remained outside longer than necessary, one hand on the porch post, watching. The road toward Frosthaven opened beneath a cold, bright sky. The storm had dragged darkness through the mountains all night, but morning had dressed the world in silver. Snow lay thick on the branches. Sunlight struck the fields in clean, white sheets. The same winter that had nearly killed Gideon now glittered like a blessing it had no right to offer. Frosthaven appeared slowly. First the church steeple, white against the ridge. Then a line of old brick storefronts along Main Street, a hardware store with a faded green awning, a diner whose neon sign blinked weakly, though it was still morning. A post office with 2 trucks buried up to their bumpers. Smoke lifted from chimneys across town, and Christmas lights still hung from a few porches, though the season had passed. Gideon had been born here, but memory did strange work. It kept smells better than street names. Wood smoke, diesel, wet wool, coffee from the diner, pine resin on his grandfather's gloves. The cabin Silas Vale left behind stood on a hill east of town, where the road turned narrow and climbed between stands of lodgepole pine. Gideon parked beneath an old cottonwood whose branches were black against the snow. For a minute he did not get out. The house looked smaller than he remembered. That disappointed him, though he could not have said why. Childhood had made it mythic. A fortress of timber and iron where Silas Vale had ruled over split wood, bad coffee, and moral instruction delivered through insults. Now it was only a cabin. Gray logs, sagging porch, rusted stovepipe, 2 cracked windows, a roof that had held against winter out of habit more than strength. A wind chime hung from the porch beam, made from old brass shell casings and pieces of thin metal. It moved in the breeze with a dry, hollow music. Bishop lifted his head at the sound. "Yeah," Gideon said quietly. "I hear it too." Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, cold ash, mouse droppings, and old oil. The floorboards complained beneath Gideon's boots as if the house had been sleeping and resented being remembered. A table stood near the kitchen wall. 1 chair. A cracked enamel mug. A stack of yellowed newspapers tied with twine. The black iron stove crouched in the corner like an old animal, with soot in its lungs. On one wall, several pale rectangles marked where pictures had once hung. Gideon moved through the rooms slowly. Bedroom, pantry, back room with shelves of tools. A narrow loft he did not trust yet. In the workshop corner, he found jars of bent nails, coils of wire, a dull hatchet, and a metal tin full of screws organized by size. That made him pause. Silas had been chaos in conversation, but a priest of order when it came to hardware. "Never trust a man who throws all his screws together," he used to say. "That's how civilization ends." Gideon looked around the ruined little cabin and almost heard the old man grumbling at death itself for poor workmanship. By noon, Gideon had the stove inspected, the worst window crack taped, and the porch swept clear enough for Bishop to lie in a strip of pale sunlight. The dog lowered himself carefully onto an old folded blanket Gideon had shaken free of dust. "You're supervisory only," Gideon told him. Bishop gave him a look. "Doctor's orders." The look deepened. "Fine, Nora's orders." Bishop rested his muzzle on his paws, apparently accepting the higher authority. The first days passed in small repairs. Not restoration. Gideon was not foolish enough to call it that. Survival came first. Stop the leaks, clear the chimney, patch the draft under the bedroom door, Find which floorboards could hold weight and which ones were dramatic liars. At night, the cabin stayed cold around the edges, no matter how hard the stove worked. Gideon slept on a narrow cot in his clothes, waking often to add wood. Bishop slept near the stove, but sometimes Gideon woke to find him standing at the door, listening to the dark, as if expecting the past to scratch its way inside. On the fourth morning, Gideon drove into town to find work. The machine shop sat behind a row of snow-buried tractors near the edge of Frosthaven. A sign over the garage door read Harlan Implement and Repair, though the word implement had lost 2 letters and most of its dignity. Inside, heat blasted from a barrel stove. The air smelled of grease, metal, burnt coffee, and practical disappointment. A man emerged from beneath a tractor engine, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered to oil. He was thick through the shoulders, broad in the waist, with a short gray-brown beard and a face that looked permanently undecided between suspicion and amusement. "You lost?" he asked. "Looking for work. That's usually a form of lost." "Gideon Vale." The man's eyebrows rose. "Silas's blood?" "Grandson," explains the expression. He always looked like he'd found a nail in his soup. "I'm told I improve with coffee. Most tragedies don't." The man stuck out a hand. "Boone Harlan." His grip was strong, warm, and scarred by years of machinery. He glanced past Gideon toward the Jeep outside, where Bishop sat watching through the cracked passenger window. "That dog judging me?" "Probably." "Good. I respect management with standards." Gideon almost smiled. Boone gave him work that same day, not out of charity, he claimed, but because 2 snowplows were down, 3 ranchers were threatening violence against their own tractors, and Boone's knees had begun negotiating retirement without permission. "If you fix engines better than you fixed your face," Boone said, nodding toward Gideon's healing cut, "we'll survive. If not, I'll pay you in insults until you quit." The rhythm helped. Mornings at the shop, afternoons at Silas's cabin, evenings with Bishop on the porch, the town lights below flickering through the cold like embers scattered in a valley. Nora came by once with soup in a blue pot and left before Gideon could argue. Elias came the next day with a bundle of scrap lumber, claimed he had found it in the way, then spent 20 minutes criticizing Gideon's method of reinforcing the porch rail before taking the hammer and doing it himself. It should have irritated Gideon. Instead, he found himself waiting for the next insult. A week passed before he began seeing Frosthaven differently. At first, the sign seemed ordinary. North Star Ridge Development. Coming soon. Mountain lodges, trails, dining, jobs. The sign stood near the road out of town and along the land near Mill Creek, clean and new against the old snow. Their blue and silver logo looked too polished for a place where most businesses still advertised with hand-painted boards and stubbornness. At the diner, 2 men argued over whether the resort would save Frosthaven or ruin it. At the hardware store, Gideon overheard a woman say her neighbor had sold 5 acres for less than half what it was worth. At Boone's shop, a rancher with a red nose and cracked hands muttered that his mother had signed something she did not understand and now owed money to people she had never met. Boone waited until they were alone under the raised hood of a snowplow before speaking plainly. "People are getting squeezed." Gideon tightened a bolt. "By North Star?" "By North Star. By their little helper outfit. By paperwork with smiles on it. They call it renewal. Help for old houses, energy upgrades, roof assistance. Sounds real pretty until a widow finds out her porch repair grew teeth." Gideon looked at him. Boone wiped his hands slowly. The humor had drained out of his face, leaving something older and less forgiving. "My father lost our south pasture to men who talked like that. Not North Star. Different suits, same wolves. They don't kick down doors anymore. They bring pens." The words stayed with Gideon the rest of the day. That evening, he stood outside Silas's cabin and looked down over Frosthaven. Smoke rose from chimneys. The church bell rang 6 times. Somewhere a dog barked, and somewhere else a truck backfired. It was a living place, imperfect and cold and stubborn. Then his eyes found the North Star sign near the creek road. its polished surface catching the last pale light. For the first time since arriving, Gideon felt something other than grief or exhaustion settle into him. Recognition, not of a person, of a pattern, a ridge weakened by survey crews, a warning sign half buried, old people signing papers they did not understand, land changing hands quietly while snow covered the tracks. Bishop came to stand beside him, moving carefully on his bandaged leg. Gideon rested 2 fingers between the dog's ears. "We didn't come here for this," he said. Bishop leaned against him. "No." The gesture seemed to answer, "But here we are." 2 days later, Gideon drove to the Crowder cabin with a bag of dog food, a hinge set Elias had pretended not to need, and the blue soup pot Nora had left at his place. The road was clearer now, though snow still rose high along the edges. The cabin appeared between the pines, smoke rising from the chimney as before. From a distance, it looked unchanged, but Gideon felt the difference before he reached the porch. No wind chimes. They hung still, though the air moved. Inside, the warmth was there, but it did not welcome him the same way. It seemed to be holding its breath. Nora sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread before her. Her hands rested on top of them, fingers curved as if she were trying to keep the pages from escaping. She wore her cream sweater and a faded apron, but there was flour on only one hand, as if she had started baking and forgotten why. Elias stood by the window, back turned, shoulders stiff. His hands were clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Bishop moved before Gideon said anything. The old dog crossed the room, slow but determined, and placed his silver muzzle on Nora's knee. Nora's face folded. "Oh, Bishop," she whispered, and the tears came as if they had been waiting for permission. Gideon set the pot down gently. "What happened?" Elias did not turn from the window. "Nothing we can't handle." Nora made a small sound. Not quite a sob. Not quite a laugh. Something worn through. Gideon looked at the papers. Frosthaven Renewal Trust. North Star Ridge appeared in smaller print beneath it. He pulled out a chair and sat without being invited. "Show me." Elias turned then, anger flaring across his weathered face. "This isn't your trouble." "No," Gideon said, "but it's on your table." Nora slid the first page toward him. The words were dressed politely. Home Safety Support, Senior Winterization Assistance, Deferred Payment Option, Property Security Clause, Administrative Processing Fees. Gideon had seen enough military contracts, supply authorizations, and official language to know when simple harm had been taught to wear a clean uniform. Nora explained in pieces. After the early storms damaged their roof and heating system, a local notary named Calvin Meeks had come by with a representative from Frosthaven Renewal Trust. Calvin had known them for years. He bought jam from Nora at church bazaars. He had notarized their wills. He told them the program was meant to help older residents stay in their homes. They signed. Then came invoices, inspection fees, materials fees, emergency scheduling fees, assessment penalties. Late charges for a payment deadline Nora said they had never been clearly told about. The total was impossible. If they could not pay, the contract allowed the trust to place a claim against the property. And the property, Gideon saw, lay directly along the proposed access road for the North Star Resort. Elias finally spoke, his voice low and humiliated. "They want us to sign transfer papers by the end of the month. Say it's better than court." Gideon read the clause again. Then again. Bishop stayed beside Nora, his head still on her knee. She stroked his torn ear with trembling fingers. "Pack what you need," Gideon said. Elias's eyes sharpened. "No. You can stay at my place until this gets sorted." I said no. "Elias, I am not leaving my house because some suit sent ugly paper through the mail." Nora looked down. Gideon heard the pride in the old man's voice. More than pride, terror disguised as pride, because for men like Elias Crowder, needing shelter felt too much like losing the last vote in their own lives. So Gideon did not push. He stood. "All right." Nora looked at him with surprise. Elias looked suspicious. Gideon gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I'm taking copies." "You're taking nothing," Elias said. "I'll bring them back. I didn't ask for help." "No," Gideon said. "You didn't." The words hung there, plain and unpolished. Then he added, "Neither did I when I knocked on your door." That quieted the room. Elias looked away first. That night, the heater failed. Gideon had driven halfway back to Silas's cabin when he realized Bishop was not settling. The dog sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, whining under his breath. Not pain, not exactly. Concern. "Easy," Gideon said. Bishop looked back through the rear window. Gideon slowed, then turned the Jeep around. By the time he reached the Crowder cabin again, cold had already crept through the walls. Elias had the stove burning high, but the back rooms were frigid. Nora sat wrapped in 2 blankets, coughing into a cloth, her face pale with the effort of pretending she was not frightened. Elias looked furious, not at Gideon, at the heater, at winter, at his own hands, at the cruel arithmetic of age. Gideon did not say, "I told you so." Men had been shot for less, and rightly. He checked the heating unit, found a cracked part he could not replace in the dark, and made the only decision available. "You're coming with me tonight." Elias opened his mouth. Gideon cut him off. "My cabin needs watching while I'm at the shop tomorrow. Stove's temperamental. Bishop needs someone sensible nearby. Nora knows more about keeping people alive than I do, and you clearly need to supervise my repairs before I destroy Montana." Nora coughed, then gave a weak smile. Elias stared at Gideon for a long time. "You always talk this much when you're lying?" "Only when I'm being polite." Bishop stood by the door, despite the pain in his leg, blocking the way as if no one was leaving the matter unfinished. Finally, Elias walked to the shelf and took down Nora's medicine box. He did not thank Gideon. He did not need to. By dawn, Nora was wrapped in blankets in the passenger seat of Elias's old truck, Bishop beside her with his muzzle resting near her hand. Elias carried 1 suitcase, 1 toolbox, and a silence large enough to fill the bed of the truck. Gideon stood by the door while the old man locked the cabin. Elias kept his hand on the knob a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned away. "Temporary," he said. Gideon nodded. "Temporary." But as the first pale light spread over Frosthaven and the 2 vehicles headed toward Silas Vale's old house on the hill, Gideon understood something he did not say aloud. Some arrangements became temporary only because people were afraid to name them mercy. And some houses, no matter how broken, began becoming homes the moment someone else needed shelter inside them. By the 3rd morning, Silas Vale's old house no longer sounded abandoned. It complained, certainly. The pipes knocked when the sink ran too long. The back door groaned like an old sinner asked to stand for prayer. The floorboards near the stove still warned everyone, loudly and without shame, that they had not been built for modern expectations. But beneath all that, the house had begun to gather life. Nora Crowder moved through the kitchen before sunrise, in thick wool socks, her cream sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows, a blue apron tied at her waist. She did not ask where things belonged. She decided. Coffee went near the stove. Flour went into the tin with the tightest lid. Gideon's collection of canned food, which had previously resembled a survival bunker designed by a depressed raccoon, was reorganized into actual meals. Elias took over the hinges. He claimed this was not kindness. It was self-defense. "No man should live with a door that screams like that," he said, kneeling by the pantry with a screwdriver in his broad hand. "It's immoral." Gideon stood nearby with a mug of coffee. "I didn't know hinges had ethics." "Everything has ethics, if it annoys me enough." From the rug near the center of the living room, Bishop watched them all. The old German shepherd had chosen that place himself, not near the stove, though the warmth helped his injured leg. Not beside Gideon's cot, as he usually preferred, the center. From there he could see Gideon at the table, Nora in the kitchen, Elias at the door, and the front window facing the snowy yard. A commander's position. Nora called it his throne. Elias called it a tripping hazard. Bishop ignored both titles with the dignity of a king who had heard worse from lesser men. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Everyone said so. Gideon said it when he cleared space in the bedroom for Nora and Elias to sleep. Nora said it while folding their clothes into Silas's old dresser. Elias said it every time he fixed something, as if improving the place might accidentally make him grateful. Temporary, however, had a way of bringing its own dishes. By the end of the week, Nora had hung a faded towel near the sink. Elias's toolbox sat under the mudroom bench. Bishop's medicine bottle stood beside Nora's reading glasses. Gideon found himself stepping more quietly in the morning so he would not wake them. The house did not look healed, but it looked less alone. Boone Harlan came by on Friday with a truck bed full of scrap lumber and opinions. He stamped snow from his boots at the door and pointed at the porch railing Gideon had repaired. "That railing is either brave or doomed." Elias looked up from the pantry hinge. "It'll hold." Boone squinted. "That's what men say right before a thing kills them." Gideon took the boards from Boone's arms. "You bring wood or commentary?" "Both. Wood's free. Commentary's priceless." Nora handed Boone coffee before the argument could mature into an afternoon. Bishop lifted his head, sniffed Boone's oil-stained gloves, then laid back down. "See?" Boone said. "Inspector approves." "He's being polite," Gideon said. "Good. One of you should try it." For a little while the room almost felt ordinary. Then the black SUV came up the hill. It appeared first as a dark shape moving between the pines, too clean for the road, too polished for the weather. It rolled to a stop beside Boone's truck, engine purring softly. The driver stepped out, wearing a charcoal wool coat that fit like money, black gloves, and boots that looked as if they had been designed by someone who had heard of mud but never met it personally. Vance Reddick smiled before he reached the porch. His smile was handsome, practiced, and empty at the edges. "Mr. Crowder," he called warmly, as if arriving for supper. "Mrs. Crowder, I was told I might find you here." Elias stood in the doorway, shoulders hardening. Nora's hand stilled around her coffee cup. Gideon stepped outside before either of them spoke. "Can I help you?" Vance looked at him with mild surprise, then adjusted immediately. Men like him always adjusted. It was part of their polish. "You must be Mr. Vale." He extended a gloved hand. "Vance Reddick, North Star Ridge Development." Gideon looked at the hand for half a second before shaking it. Vance's grip was smooth, dry, and confident. "Gideon Vale." "Yes," Vance said. "I've heard your name recently. I understand you've been assisting the Crowders." "That's generous." The word assisting came wrapped in silk and pinned with a needle. Boone leaned against his truck, arms folded, watching. Vance glanced past Gideon toward the open door. "I hope to speak with Elias and Nora directly. There seems to be some misunderstanding about their agreement with Frosthaven Renewal Trust." "No misunderstanding," Elias said from inside. "Just theft wearing a tie." Vance's smile did not disappear. It thinned. "I'm sorry you feel that way. That makes one of us." Nora touched Elias's sleeve. Not to silence him, to steady him. Vance shifted his attention to her. His voice softened by 2 degrees. "Mrs. Crowder, I know this process can feel overwhelming. Winter makes everything seem more urgent. A remote home, aging infrastructure, medical needs, it is a lot for anyone to manage. North Star is trying to offer a path forward." Gideon watched him work. Not loud, not cruel in any obvious way. He did not threaten. He arranged fear on the table and called it concern. "Court proceedings are expensive," Vance continued, "and frankly, unnecessary. The transfer option would relieve you of the debt and allow you to relocate somewhere safer, warmer, closer to town. A house like yours can become dangerous at your age." Elias took 1 step forward. "At my age," he repeated. Vance dipped his chin as if regretful. "I mean no offense. People never do when they're carrying plenty of it." Bishop rose. The movement was slow, painful enough that Gideon heard the soft scrape of his bandaged foot against the floorboards. But once the dog stood, the room changed. He came to Gideon's side and stopped there, body angled not toward attack but toward protection. His silver muzzle lifted, his amber eyes fixed on Vance. No bark, no growl at first, only attention. Vance looked down, For the first time since stepping from the SUV, something unplanned moved across his face. Bishop gave a low rumble then, not loud enough to frighten the valley, but deep enough to remind everyone in reach that old soldiers did not need youth to remember their work. Gideon placed 2 fingers lightly against the dog's neck. Easy. Bishop did not look away from Vance. Nora's voice came softly from behind them. He doesn't dislike many people. Elias snorted. He has standards. Vance recovered his smile, though it returned wearing a bruise. I can see emotions are high. I'll leave the updated documents. He pulled a black leather folder from beneath his arm and held it out. Gideon took it. Vance's eyes met his. I'd advise everyone involved to read carefully. I intend to. Good. Vance glanced toward Elias and Nora once more. Development is coming to Frosthaven, one way or another. It's better to be part of the future than buried under the past. No one answered. Vance walked back to his SUV, brushed a speck of snow from his sleeve, and drove away. Only after the vehicle disappeared down the hill did Bishop sit, slowly, with a tired breath. Gideon opened the folder. More paper, more clean language, more teeth. That afternoon, Gideon read until the words began to blur. Administrative fees, deferred cost recovery, security interest, voluntary transfer credit, failure to comply, mediation waiver. He understood enough to know he did not understand enough. That bothered him. In the SEAL teams, ignorance was not shameful unless a man pretended it was knowledge. Gideon could read terrain, pressure, body language, risk. He could listen to a room and know when the air had changed. But contracts were another battlefield, and pride was a poor weapon there. Boone, who had stayed quieter than usual, finally tapped the papers with one oil-dark finger. You need June Mallory. Elias groaned. No. Nora looked up. Elias. She's meaner than a winter fence post. Boone shrugged. That's why we like her. Gideon looked between them. Who is she? Retired lawyer, Boone said. Used to handle land records for half the county before deciding people were too stupid to deserve her help. That her official statement? Probably embroidered on a pillow somewhere, Elias muttered. She'll tell us we should have known better. Nora's face lowered. Gideon saw the shame move through the room like smoke. No, he said. Elias looked at him. Gideon closed the folder. If someone builds a trap, the blame belongs to the trapper. For a moment, Nora's eyes shone. Elias looked away. June Mallory lived in a narrow white house near the old church, where the snow along the walkway had been shoveled with military precision. Wind chimes made of blue glass hung by the door, not clattering like the Crowders' metal ones, but chiming faintly when Gideon stepped onto the porch. She opened before he knocked a second time. June was in her early 60s, slim and upright, with a blunt silver-brown bob cut to her chin and narrow glasses perched low on her nose. She wore a dark turtleneck, a long green cardigan, and the expression of a woman who had been interrupted while winning an argument with a document. Yes, June Mallory? That depends on whether you're selling something, asking for money, or about to tell me you did your own legal research on the internet. Gideon paused. None of those. Promising. Boone Harlan sent me. That lowers the promise considerably. He handed her the folder. Her eyes moved from his face to the papers. She did not invite him in. She opened the folder right there in the doorway and read the first page, then the second. Her mouth did not change, but her eyes sharpened. Where did this come from? Elias and Nora Crowder. The name landed. June went still, only slightly. Enough. You know them, Gideon said. I know most people who have been around long enough to be cheated more than once. Will you help? No. Gideon had expected hesitation, not the clean blade of refusal. June handed the folder back. No? He repeated. I'm retired. So I heard. I retired because people ignored advice until the roof was on fire, then asked why I hadn't stopped the smoke. This roof is on fire. Then call someone younger. Gideon studied her. Behind the sharpness there was fatigue. Not laziness. Weariness from a war fought in pages and signatures, where no one clapped when the innocent merely kept what already belonged to them. I don't know how to fight this, he said. June's expression shifted. Not softened, shifted. "That," she said, "is the first intelligent thing anyone has said to me all week." She stepped aside. 5 minutes. Her house smelled of paper, lemon oil, and old heat. Bookshelves lined the walls. File boxes sat in neat stacks beside a desk where a red pen rested atop a legal pad like a loaded weapon. June read while Gideon stood by the window. Bishop waited in the Jeep outside, visible through the glass. The dog sat upright despite his bandaged leg, watching the house as if prepared to testify if needed. After 10 minutes, June removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "This is ugly." "Illegal?" "Ugly and illegal are cousins." "Not always roommates." She tapped one clause. "This is predatory, maybe challengeable. But feeling violated won't win. We need records, invoices, communications, proof that fees were inflated or terms misrepresented. I can get those." "No," June said. "You can gather them. Don't confuse gathering with understanding." Gideon accepted that. She watched him with unnerving focus. "You're Silas Vale's grandson." "Yes." June leaned back. "Of course you are." He frowned. "People keep saying his name like it owes them money. In some cases, it did." She stood and walked to a cabinet near the back wall. From a drawer, she removed an old envelope, the kind that had browned at the edges with age. She hesitated before opening it. "I kept county photos from the bridge collapse," she said. "Most people forgot. Papers get archived, men get buried. The river moves on." She slid a photograph across the desk. Gideon looked down. 2 younger men stood on a half-collapsed wooden bridge, both soaked, both smeared with mud. One had a bandaged forearm and a grin too wild for good sense. Gideon knew that grin. Silas Vale. The other man stood beside him, taller, darker-haired then, jaw set, one hand gripping Silas's shoulder like he might shake him or hug him, and had not chosen yet. Elias Crowder. Gideon picked up the photograph slowly. The old cabin. The strange pauses. Elias correcting Gideon's repairs, as if angry at the bloodline itself. Silas's name guarded like a coal too hot to hold. "What happened?" Gideon asked. June folded her hands. "Ask Elias. He won't tell me." "Then wait until he does. The law can be rushed by deadlines." "People can't." She took the photo back, then surprised him by placing it in a new envelope and handing it over. "Show him this, carefully." Gideon returned to Silas's cabin near dusk. Nora was making stew. Boone had dropped off more wood and vanished before being assigned another errand. Elias sat at the kitchen table, sharpening his folding knife with slow, unnecessary strokes. Gideon placed the envelope on the table. Elias looked at it, then at him. "What's that?" "Something June Mallory gave me." Elias's face closed. "Then burn it." Gideon did not move. Nora turned from the stove. Elias opened the envelope with the tip of his knife. When the photo slid out, his hand stopped. The room grew quiet except for the stew simmering and Bishop breathing near the stove. For a long time, Elias said nothing. Then he touched the edge of the photograph with one rough finger. "Damn fool was laughing," he said. Gideon sat across from him. "Silas? Bridge went out in 78. Spring thaw came wrong. Water high, current mean. Your grandfather was checking the support beams after half the town told him not to." Elias's mouth tightened. Naturally, he went anyway. Nora came to stand behind him, one hand on his shoulder. "He got pinned when the east span dropped," Elias continued. "Water up to his chest. Cold enough to stop a man's heart from politeness alone. I tied a rope around my waist and went in after him. You saved him," Gideon said. Elias gave a humorless laugh. "He'd say I ruined his dramatic death." For a moment, the old man almost smiled. Then it faded. "After that, Silas kept saying he owed me his life. I told to stop being stupid. Then, years later, we fought over a strip of land near the creek. Survey line, pride, bad words said by 2 men old enough to know better and too dumb to act like it." He looked down at the photo. He died before either of us apologized. Gideon heard the weight beneath the words. This was not a secret that unlocked anything. No hidden deed. No buried fortune, no clean answer. Only two stubborn men, a bridge, a debt, and time doing what time did best, leaving no room to fix what pride had broken. "I didn't know," Gideon said. "No reason you would." "There is now." Elias looked up sharply. Gideon chose his next words with care. "You saved my grandfather's life." "I can't repay that. I didn't ask you to." "I know." "Then don't make it noble." "I'm not." Gideon rested his hands on the table. "I'm making it unfinished." Elias stared at him. Bishop rose from beside the stove, limped to the table, and lowered himself beside Elias's chair. Not Nora's, not Gideon's, Elias's. The old man looked down at him, brows drawn together. Bishop placed his silver muzzle against Elias's boot. For once, Elias had no insult ready. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and looked away, giving him privacy in the only way a loving wife could. Elias bent slowly and touched the dog's head. His large hand rested there, awkward at first, then gentle. "Fool dog," he murmured. Bishop closed his eyes. June came the next morning. She arrived with a leather satchel, 2 legal pads, and the moral enthusiasm of a woman preparing to dissect a snake. She sat at Silas's kitchen table, spread the contracts flat, and began marking them with a red pen. Gideon, Elias, and Nora watched in silence. After 10 minutes, she looked up. "First rule," she said. "No heroics." Her gaze landed on Gideon. He said nothing. "I mean it. No confronting Reddick in parking lots. No threatening Calvin Meeks. No breaking into offices. No righteous nonsense that feels good for 10 minutes and ruins the case for 10 years. Boone, who had wandered in with coffee, pointed at Gideon. "That speech was for you." "Thank you," Gideon said. June tapped the contract. "North Star wins if this becomes a motion against paperwork. We make it paperwork against paperwork." Elias looked at the pages with open hatred. "And if the paperwork's rotten?" June's smile was thin. "Then we find where the rot began." Outside, snow began to fall again, lightly this time. Not a storm, a veil. Gideon looked around Silas's kitchen. Nora beside the stove, Elias with one hand on Bishop's head, Boone leaning near the door, June circling clauses like a hawk over field mice. He had come to Frosthaven to disappear inside an old house. Instead, the old house had filled with witnesses, debts, arguments, soup, dog hair, and unfinished business. June drew one final red circle at the bottom of the page. "There," she said. "That's where they hid the knife." Everyone leaned in, and for the first time, Gideon understood that saving the Crowders would not come from strength alone. It would come from patience, from ink, from memory, from reading every small word at the bottom of the page where greed crouched low and waited for decent people to trust too quickly. June Mallory turned Silas Vale's kitchen table into a battlefield made of paper. By Monday morning, contracts lay in rows beside invoices, property maps, handwritten notes, county forms, and coffee cups that had gone cold from being forgotten. June moved among them with a red pen in one hand and her glasses low on her nose, circling words that looked harmless until she read them aloud. Deferred recovery, she underlined it. Administrative maintenance fee, another circle. Voluntary transfer credit. She looked up at Gideon over the rim of her glasses. That one is especially ugly. It means they want people to feel grateful while being robbed. Elias sat across from her, arms folded, jaw set as if he might bite through the table. Nora stood at the stove stirring oatmeal, though nobody had asked for oatmeal and breakfast had ended an hour ago. She cooked when she was worried. By noon, they would probably have enough food for a church funeral. Bishop lay near Elias's boots, his front right leg stretched carefully on a folded towel. The stitches were healing, but the cold still made the old dog stiff. Every so often, Elias would reach down without looking and rest his broad hand on Bishop's shoulder. The first time he did it, he seemed surprised by himself. By the third day, he acted as if the dog had always belonged there. Gideon stood by the window, reading through another invoice from Frosthaven Renewal Trust. The paper claimed a roof inspection cost $1,100. The same line appeared on 3 other homes. Same amount, same wording, different signatures. Pattern, he said. June did not look up. Patterns win cases if they come with proof. Boone Harlan had spent 2 days bringing names. He arrived each afternoon from the repair shop in his dented truck, oil still on his hands, carrying folded papers and rumors that smelled too much like truth. Widow Claire Densmore had sold her back acreage after a heating upgrade turned into a debt notice. Old Mr. Pell had moved in with a nephew after signing winterization support papers. The Able sisters, both in their 70s, had stopped attending church because they were ashamed of losing their father's pasture. "They make folks feel stupid," Boone said, dropping a list onto the table. "That's how they keep them quiet." June picked up the list. "Shame is cheaper than lawyers." Gideon looked at the names. Not targets, not case numbers. People with porches, medicine cabinets, dogs, dead spouses, bad knees, recipes, grudges, and winter bills. North Star had not attacked Frosthaven like an army. It had entered like fog under a door. Gideon and Boone spent the next several days driving from house to house. They did not ask people to accuse anyone at first. June had told them not to start with anger. Start with copies. Start with dates. Start with the exact words people remembered Calvin Meek saying when he placed papers in front of them. At the Able sisters' farmhouse, one sister made tea, while the other cried quietly into a napkin because she had believed the phrase Community Improvement Grant. At Mr. Pell's nephew's house, Gideon sat in a mudroom while an old man with shaking hands admitted he had signed because Calvin told him the deadline was that afternoon. At Claire Densmore's, Bishop stayed in the Jeep, watching through the glass while Gideon listened to a woman explain how losing land felt less like selling and more like waking to find a room missing from her own body. Each story carried the same shape: help offered, papers signed, fees arriving later like wolves after dark. Calvin Meeks appeared again and again, not as a villain with fire in his eyes, but as a neighbor with a notary stamp and a soft voice. He said it was only procedure. He said North Star had already helped others. He said I could trust him. That sentence stayed with Gideon longest. Trust was a bridge. Once someone learned how to charge a toll on it, a whole town could become stranded. At the clinic, Dr. Hollis Pike added another kind of evidence. His office sat behind the pharmacy, warm and cluttered, with anatomical charts curling at the corners and a jar of peppermints on the counter. Hollis wore a brown cardigan under his white coat and moved with the tired competence of a man who had been responsible for too many people in too many storms. He listened to Gideon, then closed the exam room door. "You didn't get this from me as gossip," Hollis said. "You got it because I'm tired of prescribing sleep medication for people whose real illness is fear." He pulled several anonymized notes, careful not to violate privacy. Increased blood pressure after legal notice. Panic episodes following debt letter. Missed appointments due to relocation threat. Nora Crowder's cough had worsened after the heat failed and stress kept her from sleeping. "Can you testify to general impact?" Gideon asked. Hollis looked at him. "I can testify that terror is bad medicine." Back at Silas's house, the days grew strangely full. Evidence gathering by morning. Work at Boone's shop when engines could not wait. Repairs at the cabin before sunset. Paperwork after dinner. Gideon had lived years by mission cycles, but this rhythm was different. There was no command center, no clean objective, no extraction point. Just people trying not to lose what had taken a lifetime to build. And inside the house, something kept softening despite the pressure. Nora taught Gideon how to make bean soup one evening after declaring that his version tasted like punishment with onions. She placed his hands correctly around the knife, showed him when to add salt, and shook her head when he chopped carrots with the grim concentration of a man diffusing ordnance. "You know food doesn't explode if you treat it kindly," she said. "Depends who cooked it." Elias, repairing the low porch step for Bishop, looked up. He installed a hinge yesterday that begged for death. "I heard that," Gideon said. "You were meant to." Bishop lay nearby, muzzle on his paws, eyes half closed in the warm draft from the stove. The lower step had been Elias's idea, though he claimed he only built it because watching Bishop limp was bad for morale. Later, when the first pie Nora baked in Silas's old oven came out slightly lopsided but fragrant with apples and cinnamon, Gideon stood at the counter longer than necessary. Nora noticed. "What?" "Nothing. That's a man's word for too much." He looked at the pie, then at the room. Elias grumbling over a crooked shelf. Bishop asleep beside the stove. Boone's spare gloves drying near the door. June's red-marked papers stacked by the lamp. "I haven't smelled that in years," Gideon said. Nora's expression softened, but she did not reach for the wound with questions. "Well," she said, cutting him a slice, "then don't waste it by standing there looking haunted." The pie was too hot. It burned his tongue. For the first time in weeks, Gideon laughed before he meant to. It was small and rough, but it was real. Everyone heard it. No one made the mistake of commenting. 2 nights later, June found the map. She had requested public land records from the county and spread them across the table in overlapping layers. Mill Creek wound through the valley in blue ink, thin and easily ignored unless one knew water did not need size to matter. North Star's proposed access road curved from the main county road, crossed near the Crowder property, then cut toward the ridge. June tapped the map. "There!" Gideon leaned closer. "Creek headwater zone. Protected review area," June said. "Any development that disturbs runoff near this section needs environmental clearance. Do they have it?" June's smile was humorless. "They applied. They do not appear to have approval." Elias frowned. "Then how are they forcing folks to sign? They're acting as if approval is inevitable." June pulled another document from beneath the map. "Worse, they're using projected access plans to pressure property transfers before the review is complete." Gideon stared at the road line. The rockfall, the half-buried sign. North Star survey crews cutting into the ridge. The proposed route. Old homes suddenly becoming obstacles wrapped in legal language. It was not just greed, it was sequence. Get the land first. Make the approval seem unstoppable later. By the time anyone understood the order of events, the valley would already be carved up and renamed. Nora sat slowly in the nearest chair. "All this for a road?" June looked at her. "For a road, lodges, service access, expansion rights, water control, and whatever comes after that once the first promise gets old." Boone whistled low. "That's a whole church sermon of ugly." Gideon kept his eyes on the map. For the first time, the fight had a shape large enough to see. June folded her hands over the file. "We need inside proof. We have contracts," Elias said. "We have patterns. We have victims. We have suspicious timing." June shook her head. "But if we want to prove they knowingly inflated costs or pushed transfers while hiding environmental delays, we need communications. Emails, internal memos, someone who saw the machinery from the inside." Boone rubbed the back of his neck. "There is one person." June looked at him sharply. "Who?" "Marla Keene," Elias muttered. "She worked for them?" "Contract accounting," Boone said. "Temporary office they set up off Ridge Road. She quit maybe 3 months back. Stopped coming into town much after." "Why?" Gideon asked. Boone's humor disappeared. "People said nerves. People say lots of things when they don't want to say guilt. Marla Keene lived at the last house before the road turned to forest. It was a narrow place with pale siding, a sagging mailbox, and curtains drawn tight in every window, though it was the middle of the afternoon. A wind-bent spruce stood near the porch like a guard that had grown tired of the job. Gideon went alone except for Bishop. June had wanted to send a letter first. Boone suggested bringing pie, because fear trusts sugar before men. Elias said nothing, which was his way of admitting both might be right. Gideon brought no pie. Nora sent bread anyway. He knocked twice. A woman's voice answered from behind the door. "Who is it?" "Gideon Vale. I'm not from North Star." A pause. That's what someone from North Star would say. Fair, he thought. I'm helping Elias and Nora Crowder. Another pause. Longer. The curtain beside the door shifted. When Marla opened the door, it remained chained. She was in her mid-40s, thin in the shoulders, with dark blonde hair tied low and eyes the pale green of creek ice. She wore a gray cardigan wrapped tight around herself, though the house behind her looked warm. Fear had not made her fragile. It had made her watchful, like an animal that had learned the cost of stepping into open ground. "I don't know anything," she said. "That's usually not true. I can't help you. You can tell me that after you hear what I'm asking." "I know what you're asking." Bishop shifted on the porch behind Gideon, lowering himself carefully to avoid pressure on his injured leg. Marla's eyes moved to him. The change was small. Her grip on the door loosened. "He's old," she said. 9. What happened to his leg? Rockfall on the West Road. Her face tightened at the word, as if it belonged to a room. In her mind she kept locked. Gideon noticed, but did not push. "He's Bishop," he said. Marla looked at the dog for several seconds. Then she closed the door. A lock turned. Gideon expected refusal. Instead, the chain slid free. Inside, Marla's house smelled of black tea and dust. Everything was tidy, but not peaceful. Stacks of unopened mail sat in a basket. A laptop lay closed on the table. A framed photograph of a heavy old mutt with cloudy eyes stood near the window. Its collar hung around one corner of the frame. Bishop saw it before Gideon did. The old shepherd limped toward the photograph and sniffed the air beneath it. Then he sat. Marla covered her mouth with one hand. "That was Otis," she said. "He died last winter." Gideon nodded once. "Good dog?" "The only one in this town who never asked me what I'd done." The words came out before she could stop them. Gideon did not answer quickly. In the quiet, the house seemed to draw a breath. Marla made tea with shaking hands. She did not offer explanations at first. She asked about Bishop's stitches, about whether he could manage steps, about whether cold made the joint worse. Gideon answered. Bishop stayed near Otis's photograph, as if honoring a fellow soldier in a war no human had named. Finally, Marla sat across from Gideon. "I signed off on invoices," she said. Her voice was flat. "Not all of them. Enough. I saw numbers change after inspections. 7,000 became 21. 21 became 38. Administrative handling. Emergency review. Senior priority scheduling. They made kindness billable. Who made the changes? Regional office approved them. Vance pushed the timelines. Calvin Meeks brought signatures back clean. Clean? Notarized. Complete. Hard to challenge. Did they know people didn't understand the security clauses? Marla laughed once, without humor. They counted on it. Outside, wind moved against the house. Bishop struggled to stand when it rattled the porch door, then steadied himself, placing his weight carefully. The movement cost him. Gideon saw the tremor in the dog's shoulder. So did Marla. Her face crumpled in a way fear had not managed to do. He should be resting. He thinks resting is for civilians. Otis was like that near the end, she whispered. Could barely climb the steps. But if I cried, he'd drag himself across the room like he had one last job. Bishop took one slow step toward her, then another. He placed his silver muzzle against her knee. Marla broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. She bent over the dog's head and cried with both hands buried in the thick fur behind his ears. Bishop stood still, patient under the weight of another human sorrow, as if his old body had been built for exactly this kind of burden. "I was scared," she said into his fur. "I kept telling myself I didn't create the system, I just processed numbers." Gideon's voice stayed quiet. "Systems need hands." She nodded, crying harder. After a while, she stood and went to the pantry. From behind a row of tea tins, she took out a small metal box. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in a receipt. "I copied emails before I quit," she said. "I don't know why. Maybe because cowardice likes souvenirs." She placed it on the table between them. Gideon did not touch it immediately. "Marla, if you give me this, they may come after you. They already have, just not where people can see." "What's on it?" "Cost revisions. Internal messages about elderly signers. Environmental delay updates. A memo saying not to mention Mill Creek Review unless asked directly by county officials. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. And one email from Vance. He wrote that emotional resistance from legacy owners should be overcome before public hearings. Legacy owners. Gideon felt something cold move through him. Not rage. Rage was hot and easy. This was cleaner. This was the moment a target stopped being a shadow. He picked up the USB. Marla wiped her face and looked toward Bishop. "Will it help them keep the house?" "It gives the truth a body," Gideon said. "June will know how to make it stand." When he left, Marla came onto the porch despite the cold. Bishop paused at the top step, and Marla crouched carefully to kiss the silver fur between his ears. "Thank you," she whispered. The dog leaned into her once, then followed Gideon to the Jeep. Snow began again as they drove back toward Silas's cabin, light and steady, falling over Frosthaven without choosing sides. Gideon kept the USB in his coat pocket, his hand resting over it like a man carrying a live coal. At the house, June plugged it into an old laptop while everyone gathered around the kitchen table. Emails opened, names appeared, numbers changed, phrases repeated. Do not disclose environmental status unless required. Prioritize acquisition of aging owner parcels. Legacy resistance expected. Apply relocation pressure. Nora sat down slowly. Elias did not curse. That was how Gideon knew the anger had gone too deep for language. June read until the room seemed to shrink around the glow of the screen. Then she leaned back, removed her glasses, and looked at Gideon. "This is enough to stop whispering." Boone exhaled. "Meaning?" June's eyes moved from Elias to Nora, then to Bishop lying beneath the table, his injured leg stretched beside Gideon's boot. "Meaning, if we want this to matter, it has to leave this kitchen." Outside, the snow thickened over the dark windows. Inside, the truth finally had shape, weight, and a name. But truth, Gideon knew, was like fire in winter. Kept hidden, it only warmed the hands nearby. Carried into the open, it could either light the town or burn everyone brave enough to hold it. The white church at the center of Frosthaven had been built before the town learned how to argue politely. That was what Boone Harlan said while parking his truck beside a snowbank high enough to swallow a mailbox. Place has heard funerals, weddings, potlucks, bankruptcies, and at least 3 fistfights over chili, he said, killing the engine. Should survive a development meeting. Gideon looked through the windshield. The church stood against the winter evening like something carved from bone and candlelight. Snow covered the roof in a clean white slope. Warm yellow light shone through the tall windows, spilling onto the steps where townspeople moved in slow clusters, stamping snow from their boots, speaking in low voices, carrying fear under their coats. Frosthaven had come. Not all of it with the same heart. Some came because they had been hurt. Some came because they wanted answers. Some came because North Star Ridge promised jobs, tax money, tourists, and a future that did not require their sons and daughters to leave town for work. Some came simply because small towns could smell a reckoning the way dogs smelled thunder. Bishop sat in the back seat, his silver muzzle lifted between the front seats. His injured leg had healed enough for careful walking, but cold still made it stiff. Nora had wrapped a dark wool scarf loosely around his neck, declaring that old warriors deserved dignity and warmth. Elias had called it foolish. Then he had adjusted the scarf twice. Gideon opened the truck door and stepped into the cold. He wore his olive combat shirt beneath a dark canvas coat, his boots cleaned but still scarred. No medals, no uniform, no attempt to dress himself as a symbol. The folder under his arm held maps, invoices, printed emails, and statements June had organized with ruthless precision. Inside the church, the air smelled of old wood, wet wool, coffee, and radiator heat. Rows of wooden pews were already full. People stood along the walls. The altar had been cleared, replaced by a projector screen and folding tables. Someone had set a tray of cookies near the back, because even outrage in Frosthaven apparently required sugar. June Mallory sat at the front table with her leather satchel open, red pen tucked behind one ear. She looked less like a retired lawyer than an executioner who preferred punctuation. Boone stood near the aisle, greeting people with nods and short jokes that did not quite hide how tense he was. Doctor. Hollis Pike sat 2 rows behind the Crowders, hands folded over his wool cap, his usually calm face tightened by what he had agreed to say in public. Marla Keene sat near the back. She had chosen an aisle seat, probably in case fear convinced her to flee. Her dark blonde hair was tied low, her gray coat buttoned to the throat, and both hands held a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. When Bishop entered beside Gideon, Marla's eyes followed him. The dog turned his head, saw her, and gave one slow wag of his tail. Marla breathed for what seemed like the first time all evening. Nora and Elias sat in the second row. Nora wore her pale sweater beneath a navy coat, the small pine leaf necklace resting at her throat. Elias sat beside her with his hands clasped over his knees, wearing a clean flannel shirt and his old bridge crew cap. His jaw had the set of a man determined not to break in front of neighbors. At 7 sharp, the town council chair, a narrow woman named Ruth Bell with a silver braid and the exhausted eyes of someone who had read too many public comments, struck the table once with a small wooden gavel. "We're here," she said, "to discuss concerns regarding North Star Ridge Development, Frosthaven Renewal Trust, and proposed access routes near Mill Creek." A murmur traveled through the church. Then Vance Reddick stood. He had arrived with 2 lawyers and a projector presentation. His dark suit fit perfectly. His black overcoat hung over the back of his chair like a shadow trained to behave. He smiled at the room, not too wide, not too warm, just enough to make doubt look unreasonable. "Thank you, Chairwoman Bell," he began. "And thank you, Frosthaven, for showing up tonight. That proves something important. You care about this town's future." He clicked a remote. The screen filled with an image of a shining lodge beneath snow-capped mountains. Fireplaces, ski trails, families laughing with expensive gloves, a restaurant patio lit by strings of golden bulbs. The future, apparently, had excellent lighting. Vance spoke of jobs, seasonal revenue, road improvements, medical access, young people staying, old storefronts reopening, tax dollars for schools. Though Frosthaven had no school now and no children in this story to be used as decoration for a sales pitch. He made greed sound like rescue. He made surrender sound like planning. Gideon watched the crowd, not the screen. That was where truth moved, in tightened mouths, folded arms. The way one old rancher stared at the floor when employment was mentioned. The way Claire Densmore, seated near the back, looked at the glossy lodge and then at her own hands. Vance did not mention the inflated invoices. He did not mention the elderly property owners. He did not mention Mill Creek. He did not mention the emails. When he finished, half the room clapped. The other half did not. Ruth Bell turned toward June. "Miss Mallory." June rose without hurry. She carried no performance in her body, only papers. "I'm not here to argue whether Frosthaven needs work," she said. "It does. Anyone who has driven past the diner sign knows that." A few people chuckled softly. June continued. "I'm here because there is a difference between development and extraction. One builds with a town, the other feeds on it." Vance smiled faintly, as though forgiving her tone in advance. June placed the first set of invoices on the projector table. The screen changed from luxury lodges to numbers. Roof inspection, $1,100. Administrative maintenance fee, $2,400. Emergency scheduling adjustment, $3,800. Deferred recovery total, $38,642. This, June said, was attached to a repair package for Elias and Nora Crowder after storm damage. Independent estimates Planuna grouse the actual necessary repair work under $8,000. A stir moved through the pews. June clicked again. Another invoice, another homeowner. Similar fees, similar phrasing. Then another and another. "These are not mistakes," she said. "Mistakes wander. These march." Vance stood. "May I respond?" "You'll get your turn," Ruth Bell said. Her voice carried more steel than her narrow frame suggested. Boone spoke next, not from the table, but from the aisle. He did not like podiums. He claimed they made honest men look like auctioneers. He held a cap in both hands and named people, gently, not to expose them, but to show they were not alone. Claire Densmore, Mr. Pell, the Able sisters. Two others who had given permission for their cases to be mentioned without details. Folks got told these were help papers, Boone said. They got told sign here, initial there. Don't worry, Calvin knows the process. Then the bills came wearing boots. A low rumble moved through the church. Calvin Meeks sat near the front on the right side. His round face had gone pale. He wore a gray vest and a tie that had slipped slightly off-center. His black pen remained clipped to his shirt pocket, absurdly neat, like a little flag planted on cowardice. Dr. Hollis Pike stood next. He did not accuse anyone of crimes. He was careful, specific, measured, but his words landed hard. I've seen increased stress-related symptoms among several older residents after receiving debt notices and relocation pressure, he said. Sleep loss, elevated blood pressure, anxiety episodes, medication changes. I can't speak to legal intent. I can speak to harm. The room quieted. Harm was harder to wave away when the town doctor named it. Then Marla stood. For a moment, it seemed she might sit back down. Her hand clutched the edge of the pew. Her face was white, her mouth tight. Gideon saw her look toward the exit. Bishop saw her too. The old dog rose beside Gideon, slow and stiff, and turned his head toward her. He did not move down the aisle. He did not make a sound. He simply stood, silver muzzle lifted, as if lending her the courage to remain standing. Marla swallowed. "My name is Marla Keene," she said. "I worked contract accounting for North Star Ridge's local office." Vance's face changed, but only around the eyes. Marla continued, voice trembling. "I reviewed invoices for Frosthaven Renewal Trust. I saw charges increased after initial inspections. I saw internal notes about senior property owners being more likely to accept deferred payment terms. I saw emails instructing staff not to discuss the Mill Creek environmental review unless directly asked by county officials." A man near the back muttered something under his breath. Marla looked down at the paper in her hands. "I signed off on some of it. Not all. Enough. I told myself I was just processing numbers." Her voice broke, but she did not sit. "I was afraid, and my fear helped them keep doing it." No one clapped. It would have been wrong to clap. But something passed through the church, quiet and solemn, like a bell that rang inside people instead of above them. Vance rose before Ruth could call on him. "I sympathize with Miss Keene's distress," he said smoothly. "But what we are hearing tonight is an emotional narrative built around misunderstandings, isolated paperwork, and personal regret. Frosthaven is at a crossroads. Growth is uncomfortable. Change is often misread as threat by those afraid of losing the past." He turned then, not to June, but to Gideon. "And Mr. Vale, while I respect his service, has only recently returned here under difficult personal circumstances. A combat veteran, newly separated from his former life, now living with the Crowders and inserting himself into complex civic matters. I ask this council to consider whether this is truly about the law or about a man searching for a new war because peace has become too painful." The church went still. There it was. Not a punch, a scalpel. Gideon felt the words enter cleanly. Former life, difficult personal circumstances, new war. He saw again the window in Spokane. The turned-down wedding photograph, the red flannel on another man's shoulders. For one heartbeat, Vance had dragged the private ruin into the public aisle and held it up like evidence. Heat rose in Gideon's chest. Elias shifted as if about to stand. June's eyes snapped toward Gideon, warning him without speaking. Bishop moved first. He leaned against Gideon's leg. Not hard, just enough. Then the old dog lifted his head and pressed his muzzle into Gideon's open hand. Not to pull him away, to bring him back. Gideon looked down at him. Bishop's amber eyes were calm. The anger did not vanish. It became something usable. Gideon stood. "I did come here broken," he he said. His voice was quieter than Vance's had been. The room strained to hear him. I came here after losing the life I thought I was returning to. I came through a storm, wrecked my Jeep under a ridge North Star crews had been cutting into, and knocked on the Crowder's door half-frozen with my dog bleeding beside me. He paused. Elias and Nora did not ask for my credit score, my politics, or my usefulness. They opened the door. Nora lowered her eyes. Gideon lifted the map of Mill Creek and pinned it to the board beside the invoice projections. So yes, this is personal. It became personal when I watched decent people made ashamed of trusting a neighbor. But the evidence is not personal. He placed printed emails beneath the map. These are North Star communications provided by a former employee. They show cost revisions, pressure timelines, and instructions not to disclose the incomplete Mill Creek environmental review unless directly required. The proposed access road crosses a protected headwater zone, yet property owners were pressured to transfer land as if approval were already settled. June stepped beside him and gave the legal structure to what Gideon had made plain. Dates, clauses, missing approvals, identical fees, internal language, acquisition priority. Vance's lawyers began whispering. That was when Elias stood. No one expected it. Least of all Elias. He removed his old bridge crew cap and held it in both hands. "I'm not good at talking," he said. Boone muttered, "First true thing tonight," and Nora elbowed him without looking. A few people smiled. Elias looked out at the town. "When I was young, this place was poor. Don't let anybody pretty it up. Winters were mean. Work was hard. People drank too much coffee and not enough sense. But if your roof went bad, somebody showed up. If your truck died, somebody pulled you out. If your wife was sick, soup came to your porch before pride could stop it." His rough fingers tightened around the cap. "I'm not against jobs. I'm not against young folks having a reason to stay. But if the price of light is throwing old people into the dark, then maybe that light ain't worth buying." Silence followed. Then Calvin Meeks made a sound. It was small, a chair leg scraping. He stood with one hand gripping the pew in front of him. His face shone with sweat despite the cold room. "I told them it was procedure," he said. The whole church turned. Calvin stared at the floor. "I told Mrs. Densmore, Mr. Pell, the Crowders, others. I said the papers were standard. I didn't explain the security clauses. I didn't understand all of it at first, and later I didn't want to understand because the referral fees came through and North Star said the project would help town business." His voice cracked. "I notarized signatures. I told myself signatures meant consent." June asked, "Were you paid per completed file?" Calvin closed his eyes. "Yes." The word fell into the room and did not get back up. Vance stood. "Mr. Meeks is clearly under emotional pressure." Ruth Bell struck the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Reddick." This time, the room heard whose authority mattered. The vote took 23 minutes. There were arguments, real ones. A restaurant owner stood and said the town needed jobs. A mechanic's wife said jobs built on fraud would rot. A younger lodge worker said North Star was the first company in years to notice Frosthaven. Claire Densmore replied that wolves noticed sheep too. In the end, the council voted to suspend all municipal cooperation with North Star Ridge pending county review, refer the contracts and environmental concerns to state and county authorities, and authorize a volunteer legal coalition to assist affected property owners. No one cheered at first. The decision felt too heavy for cheering. Then Nora reached for Elias's hand. Boone exhaled like a man setting down an engine block. Marla sat slowly, trembling. Bishop lowered himself to the floor at Gideon's feet and rested his chin on his paws. Vance gathered his papers with perfect care. His face remained composed, but the smile had cracked. Not shattered, cracked, like ice that still looked safe until the next step. At the church doors, he paused beside Gideon. "This isn't over," he said softly. Gideon looked at him. "No," he said, "but now they know it started." Vance left without another word. Outside, the night was clear and brutally cold. Stars burned over Frosthaven like silver nails hammered into the dark. People lingered on the church steps, speaking in low voices, some ashamed, some angry, some relieved, all of them awake in a way they had not been before. Elias stood beside Gideon at the bottom step. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Elias said, "You didn't hit him." "No. Thought you might." "So did I." Elias nodded once, approving without softening. "Dog stopped you?" Gideon looked down at Bishop, who stood between them, scarf crooked, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "He reminded me what I was there to protect." Nora came down the steps and tucked the scarf back into place around Bishop's neck. "Then he did better than most lawyers," she said. June, passing behind them, replied, "Barely." For the first time that night, Gideon laughed. Not loudly, not fully, but enough. Across the street, the North Star presentation posters still glowed in the windows of the Town Hall Annex, showing lodges that had not yet been built and promises that had not yet been earned. Behind Gideon, the white church stood warm, with people still inside. Frosthaven had not been saved, not yet. But the old people were no longer alone with their papers. And for one winter night, that was enough to make the dark step back. Winter stayed in Frosthaven, but it lost some of its cruelty. The snow no longer came like an army. It drifted in soft, bright sheets over the rooftops, settled on fence rails, and glittered along Mill Creek, where the ice thinned near the stones. Morning light touched the valley differently now, less like judgment, more like a hand laid gently over a bruise. Nora said the snow looked like flour sifted over fresh bread. Gideon, carrying an armload of split wood toward the porch, said it looked like cold cement dust. Nora stopped in the doorway, one hand on her hip, pale sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows. "That," she said, "is why I don't let you describe food." Elias, kneeling by the porch steps with a hammer in one hand, grunted. "Man's soul is a toolbox with a draft in it." Gideon set the wood down. "You two rehearse these?" "Don't need to," Elias said. "You provide inspiration." Bishop lay in a stripe of weak sunlight near the door, his dark scarf folded beneath his chest like a royal cushion Nora had absolutely not admitted to placing there. His right front leg still stiffened in the cold, and he rose more slowly than before. But his eyes remained clear, amber, and watchful. Whenever Gideon came up the steps, Bishop lifted his head just enough to make sure the man had returned in one piece. Weeks had passed since the town meeting at the White Church. North Star Ridge had not vanished. Companies like that did not disappear in a puff of shame. They hired attorneys. They issued statements. They called the investigation a misunderstanding and promised full cooperation while paying people to cooperate as little as possible. But something had changed. The county had frozen several property transfers connected to Frosthaven Renewal Trust. The State Environmental Office had opened a formal review of the Mill Creek access route. A group of volunteer lawyers, led unwillingly and therefore fiercely by June Mallory, had begun organizing claims for residents who had been pressured into signing predatory contracts. Elias and Nora's house was safe for now, not fixed, not fully theirs without question, but safe from forced transfer while the investigation moved forward. That was not a miracle. It was paperwork, signatures, public pressure, and stubborn people who refused to go home when the room got uncomfortable. Gideon respected it more than a miracle. Miracles asked too little of men. The old cabin of Silas Vale had also changed. No hidden fortune had appeared beneath a floorboard. No letter from the dead explained everything. No long-lost bank account transformed Gideon into a wealthy savior. The house had yielded only dust, bent nails, squirrel damage, and one jar of screws so perfectly organized that Gideon had nearly saluted it out of respect for his grandfather's madness. The work was ordinary. Replace roof boards, patch the kitchen wall, fix the stovepipe, reinforce the porch, hang shelves, tighten railings, seal windows, build a lower step for Bishop. Then rebuild that same step because Elias said the first version looked like it had been designed by a committee of drunken beavers. Gideon worked at Boone's shop in the mornings and on the cabin in the afternoons. Some evenings, neighbors came by with materials they claimed were Left over, a roll of insulation, a stack of shingles, a box of nails, a bag of coffee. Nobody wanted thanks. In Frosthaven, generosity preferred to wear work gloves and pretend it was inconvenience. Nora had taken command of the kitchen completely. Temporary, she still said. Then she bought curtains. Elias continued to say they would return to their own house as soon as repairs and legal matters allowed. Then he built a second chair for the porch. It was made from salvaged pine, solid and plain, with arms wide enough for a mug of coffee. Gideon noticed it beside the first chair one morning and said nothing. 2 days later, Elias dragged out more lumber. "What's that for?" Gideon asked. "None of your business. It's my porch." Then stop staring at it like a calf at a new gate. By evening, there were 3 chairs, one slightly taller, one with a folded cushion Nora had sewn from an old wool blanket. One built wider and heavier, as if made for a man who had spent most of his life pretending he did not need rest. Gideon stood at the window after supper, looking at them. Nora came beside him, drying her hands on a towel. "He won't say it," she said. "I know. He thinks words make things fragile. Sometimes they do. Sometimes silence does worse." Gideon looked down at Bishop, who had settled between them, leaning his weight against Nora's leg. 3 chairs, Gideon said quietly. Nora smiled, but her eyes shone. Porches look foolish with 2. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came in a plain envelope forwarded from Spokane, with Gideon's name printed in careful handwriting that he recognized before opening it. He stood by the mailbox longer than necessary, snow gathering on his shoulders, the paper held between 2 fingers like something that might either burn or crumble. Bishop waited beside him, sniffed the air, then looked up. Gideon walked back inside. The house was unusually quiet. Nora had gone with June to deliver paperwork to the county office. Elias was in the shed arguing with a saw blade. Boone was at the shop. The stove ticked softly in the living room. Gideon sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Divorce papers. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Signed where they needed to be signed. A short note folded inside. "I'm sorry for the way you found out. I don't know how to explain when I stopped waiting without making it sound like I blame you. I don't. I hope you find peace somewhere kinder than we became." He read it once, then again. The words did not cut the same way the window had. They hurt, but differently. The first wound had been shock. This was the cleaning of it. Necessary, unforgiving. He took off his wedding ring. For a long time, it sat in his palm, a small circle, a promise that had outlived the life around it. Bishop rose slowly from the rug and came to him. The old dog placed his silver muzzle on Gideon's knee and stood there without asking anything. Gideon closed his fingers around the ring. "I wanted to hate her," he said. Bishop listened. "It would have been easier." The dog's ears flicked. Gideon breathed out, slow and tired. But she kept living. I didn't. He signed the papers. No thunder rolled. No ghost spoke. No great door slammed in the heavens. Only the scratch of a pen, the soft pop of the stove, and Bishop's steady warmth against his leg. When Nora returned, she found him still at the table. She did not ask to read the papers. She only put a bowl of soup in front of him. "Eat first," she said. "Falling apart is harder on an empty stomach." Gideon looked at her. Then he laughed, barely. "Yes, ma'am." That evening, he placed the ring in a small wooden box he had found among Silas's things. He did not throw it into the fire. He did not need to punish the past to leave it behind. Some things deserved burial, not burning. Days lengthened. The light lingered later on the ridge. Mill Creek began to murmur beneath thinning ice. Bishop resumed his morning patrols, though they had become less military and more ceremonial. First to the kitchen, where Nora poured coffee and slipped him a corner of toast she insisted was accidental. Then to the woodshed, where Elias pretended not to wait for him. Then to Gideon's workbench, where he would sit with great seriousness and supervise sanding, measuring, and the occasional act of human incompetence. He no longer belonged only to Gideon. That realization should have hurt. Instead, it loosened something, Love, Gideon was learning, did not weaken when shared among the right people. It became less afraid. One afternoon, after a light snow, Elias asked Gideon to drive him to the Crowder cabin. The legal freeze was still in place. The house stood empty but watched over, smoke absent from its chimney, windows bright with reflected snow. Gideon parked near the porch. Bishop came with them, stepping carefully onto the path Elias had cleared weeks earlier. Inside, the cabin smelled cold and familiar. Nora had not come. Elias said this errand was between men and one nosy dog. He walked to the wall near the stove and took down the old harmonica that had hung there since the night Gideon first arrived. Its metal was tarnished, its wooden comb darkened by time and hands. Elias held it for a long moment. "Silas left this after the bridge collapse," he said. Gideon said nothing. He came by a week later. Arm bandaged. Face still bruised. Said he'd only dropped in to make sure I hadn't died from the cold because he didn't want to owe a dead man. Elias snorted softly. "Then he forgot this on the table. Why didn't you give it back?" Elias looked at the harmonica. "Meant to." The answer carried 40 years. He turned the instrument over in his rough fingers. "Then we fought over that strip of creek land. Stupid thing. Boundary line was off. He said one thing. I said another. Both of us too proud to let a survey settle what our mouths had already ruined. He swallowed. After that, keeping it felt like winning. Then it felt like punishment. Then it just felt too late." Bishop sat near Elias's boot. The old man looked down at him. "Don't give me that look." Bishop continued giving it. Elias sighed. "Fine." He held the harmonica out to Gideon. "Here." Gideon did not take it at once. "That was between you and Silas. Silas is dead. I'm not him." "No," Elias said. "You're not. Thank God for small improvements." Gideon's mouth twitched. Elias pushed the harmonica toward him again. "I can't give it back to him. I can give it forward." The words settled in the cold cabin. Gideon accepted it. The harmonica was heavier than it should have been. Not because of metal. Because of all the years men had carried instead of spoken. Elias cleared his throat. "Don't make a sermon out of it." "I wouldn't dare." "You would." Quietly. "In your head." "Probably." Elias nodded once, satisfied by the confession. They drove back near sunset. That evening, the 3 chairs waited on the porch of Silas Vale's house. Nora brought out coffee wrapped in a towel to keep the mugs warm. Elias lowered himself into the heavier chair with a groan he denied making. Gideon sat in the middle one because Nora pointed, and he had learned the limits of resistance. Nora took the cushioned chair, tucking her coat around her knees. Bishop settled at their feet, his black and gold body stretched across the porch boards, his silver muzzle resting on his paws. Below them, Frosthaven glowed in the valley. Not with resort lights, not with polished promises printed on glossy paper, just windows, kitchen lamps, the diner sign blinking stubbornly. The church steeple pale against the blue dusk, houses where people had begun talking again, comparing letters, sharing names, refusing shame. Gideon held Silas's harmonica in one hand. He did not know how to play it. That seemed right. Some inheritances were not meant to be performed immediately. Some were meant to be held until the hand stopped shaking. Nora looked toward the valley. "Looks warm from up here." "Looks small," Elias said. "Small things can still hold light." Gideon glanced at her. She smiled without looking back. "That one you may borrow." "No charge?" "First one's free." Bishop sighed deeply, as if the conversation had failed to meet his standards. Gideon examined to the dog, then at Elias and Nora, then at the 3 chairs on the porch his grandfather had built and time had nearly taken apart. He had not won his old life back. He had not erased war from his sleep. He had not defeated North Star in one glorious blow or healed every person they had harmed. But the Crowders had a place at his table. Bishop had a family to patrol. Frosthaven had remembered how to stand together, and Gideon, who had once stood outside a window with a key in his hand and nowhere to put his grief, now sat beneath a porch roof with people who expected him to be there tomorrow. That was no small thing. In the valley, lights blinked on one by one. Bishop shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Gideon's boot. Elias grumbled that the dog was hogging all the heat. Nora told him he had plenty of insulation. Gideon laughed softly into the winter air. Above them, the first stars appeared over the Beartooth Mountains. And the old house, patched and imperfect, held them all. Not because blood had commanded it. Not because the past had been repaired cleanly, but because one storm, one wounded dog, and one open door had carried 3 lonely lives toward each other, until a porch that once had no reason for chairs finally had 3. Sometimes the road away from heartbreak is the very road that leads us home. Gideon did not find the life he lost. He found something quieter, stronger, and more lasting. A porch with room for him, an old dog who never stopped guiding him, and people who reminded him that family can still be built after trust has been broken. Maybe that is one of God's gentlest mercies, not always giving us back what was taken, but leading us toward what can still grow. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in second chances, quiet miracles, and the kind of love that waits with an open door, please subscribe for more stories like this. May peace find your home, and may hope leave a light on for you.